Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about a question that has left countless people confused, frustrated, and searching for answers. Why does a man who desires you remain silent? It seems paradoxical, doesn't it? Shouldn't desire naturally lead to action? Well, not necessarily. And the truth behind this silence is far more complex than you might think. A man who craves you doesn't just want you in the simple, fleeting sense of desire. It's not just attraction, nor is it just longing. It's something deeper, more primal, and far more complicated. Desire, when it's genuine, is inseparable from responsibility. And that's where things get difficult. When a man desires a woman, it isn't merely a thought that flickers in his mind like a passing daydream. It's an awareness, an acknowledgement that taking action means entering a world of expectations, duty, and commitment. This is not a trivial realization. If he steps forward and makes his desire known, he is no longer just a man with feelings. He becomes a man with obligations. And obligations are heavy. For centuries, men have been conditioned to see relationships as more than just emotional connections. They are contracts, psychological, emotional, and even spiritual contracts that come with responsibility. To desire a woman is to accept on some level that if he is to claim her as his own, he must also protect, provide, and uphold a certain standard of strength. Even in modern society, where gender roles have shifted, this expectation remains deeply embedded in the male psyche, and many men, especially those who have not yet solidified their own path, are utterly terrified of that responsibility. This is why a man may crave you yet remain silent. It is not that he doesn't want you, it is that he fears what wanting you truly means. If he approaches you and expresses his feelings, the dynamic between you changes instantly. He is no longer a passive observer of his emotions. He becomes an active participant in a relationship, a role that demands he step up, take charge of his own emotional world, and integrate another person into it. That is no small feat, and for a man who feels unprepared, uncertain, or even inadequate, silence is the easier path. Consider what this means on a psychological level. When a man desires something intensely but simultaneously feels overwhelmed by its weight, his instinct is often to retreat. This is not unique to relationships. We see this in careers, personal goals, and life-altering decisions. The things that hold the most meaning also hold the most potential for failure. And failure, particularly in the realm of relationships, is devastating. If a man truly craves you, then you are not just a casual interest to him. You represent something profound. You represent validation, intimacy, and even a sense of purpose. But you also represent risk. What if he is not good enough for you? What if he pursues you only to disappoint you? What if he claims to want you, but deep down he knows he is not yet the man he wants to be? These thoughts do not emerge in the form of clear, logical sentences in his mind. They manifest as hesitation, as silence, as an inexplicable pulling away despite the obvious craving that lingers beneath the surface. There is also the question of self-worth. Many men do not pursue what they desire, not because they do not want it, but because they do not believe they deserve it. This is particularly true for men who struggle with personal insecurities, financial instability, or unresolved emotional wounds. A man who feels like he is not yet the person he is supposed to be may crave you deeply and yet choose to remain silent precisely because he respects you too much to bring you into his chaos. This silence, then, is not always a reflection of indifference. It is often a reflection of a battle within, a war between wanting and fearing, between desire and duty. The weight of responsibility extends beyond just his own internal struggles. There is also the cultural and societal pressure to be a man in the traditional sense. In many cultures, a man is expected to be a provider, a pillar of strength, someone who has his life in perfect order before he dares to involve a woman in it. While this is not always a fair expectation, it is one that still governs the subconscious minds of many men. They may crave a deep emotional connection, but if they feel like they are not yet in a position to provide stability, emotionally, financially, or mentally, they will choose silence over action. Now, does this mean that silence should always be excused? Absolutely not. A man who remains silent forever is a man who has chosen fear over growth. At some point, if his craving is genuine, he must take responsibility, not just for his desire, but for his inaction. He must decide that the weight of responsibility is worth carrying, and if he remains paralyzed by fear, by insecurity, or by hesitation, then his silence is your answer. Because desire without action is meaningless. A man's craving for you is not just about wanting you. It is about whether he believes he can step into the role that wanting you requires. It is about whether he has the courage to face the responsibilities that come with love, commitment, and growth. So, if he craves you and remains silent, understand this. His silence is not about you, it is about him. It is about his internal struggles, his readiness, and his willingness to rise to the challenge that real desire demands. And if he cannot break that silence, then he was never ready to have you in the first place. Life is a constant struggle between order and chaos, between stability and uncertainty. Relationships at their core embody this very battle. They are not merely about love, attraction, or companionship. They are about the delicate dance between structure and unpredictability. A man who remains silent despite craving you is likely caught in this very struggle. On one hand, he longs for the stability that love and connection provide, but on the other, he fears the unknown variables that come with opening himself up to someone else. Order represents security, predictability, and control. It is the foundation upon which a person builds their life. A structured routine, a clear vision of the future, a firm grasp of personal identity, all of these fall under the domain of order. A man who has worked hard to establish a sense of control in his life may see a relationship as either a natural extension of that order or a threat to it. If he perceives love as something that will bring balance and support, he will pursue it willingly. However, if he sees it as something that might disrupt his carefully built world, he will hesitate even if he desires it deeply. Chaos, on the other hand, is the unknown. It is emotion, unpredictability, and the loss of control. Relationships introduce chaos because they demand change. They require vulnerability, compromise, and the willingness to adapt to another person's world. Even the most structured man, no matter how much he values control, cannot predict how love will transform him. This uncertainty can be terrifying. What if he falls too deeply and loses himself? What if he is forced to confront aspects of himself that he has carefully avoided? What if the person he craves does not fit into the life he has envisioned? These questions weigh on him more than he might even realize. A man who remains silent despite his desire is likely trapped between these two opposing forces. He knows that taking action, pursuing the person he craves, means stepping into the unknown. It means inviting chaos into his life. And while chaos can bring excitement, passion, and growth, it can also bring discomfort, pain, and the risk of failure. He may crave love, but if he has spent his life seeking control, the unpredictability of relationships might be too much for him to face. This internal battle is not always a conscious one. He may not sit down and analyze his fear of chaos in logical terms. Instead, it manifests in hesitation, in silence, in the inability to act despite the intensity of his emotions. He might make excuses, convincing himself that it is not the right time, that he needs to focus on his career, that he must get his life together first. These reasons may sound rational, but beneath them often lies a deeper truth. He is not ready to let go of his grip on order. He is not yet willing to surrender to the natural uncertainty that relationships bring.
For some men, silence is a form of self-preservation. If they do not act, they cannot fail. If they do not step forward, they cannot be hurt. They have seen the way relationships crumble, the way love turns to heartbreak, the way passion fades into routine. They understand on some level that the moment they step into a relationship, and so they choose silence. not because they do not feel, but because feeling too much threatens their sense of stability. At the same time, there is a paradox in this struggle. While a man may fear the chaos of relationships, he also craves the very things that chaos brings: passion, connection, meaning. He might long for the unpredictability of love, for the thrill of the unknown, for the depth of emotion that only relationships can provide. This is why his silence is so frustrating, not just to those who desire him, but to himself. He knows what he wants, yet he is unable to take the necessary steps toward it. He is paralyzed between the safety of order and the call of chaos. The irony is that growth, true, meaningful growth, only occurs when one is willing to step beyond order and embrace a certain degree of chaos. No great transformation happens within the confines of perfect control. The most successful people, the most fulfilled individuals, are not those who remain rigid in their routines, but those who are willing to take risks, to embrace uncertainty, to allow themselves to be shaped by experiences beyond their control. A man who remains silent out of fear of chaos is not truly living. He is merely existing within the boundaries of what feels safe. At some point, he must make a choice. He must decide whether his desire outweighs his fear. He must come to terms with the fact that love, like life itself, is unpredictable. That no matter how much he craves control, there are some things that cannot be neatly organized or perfectly planned. If he wants something real, something meaningful, he must be willing to risk discomfort, to step beyond his structured world and allow himself to experience the unknown. If he does not, then his silence is not just hesitation, it is a choice to remain stagnant, a choice to avoid growth, a choice to stay within the confines of what feels safe rather than reach for something greater. And if that is the case, then the person he craves must also make a choice to wait for a man who may never overcome his fear, or to seek someone who is willing to embrace both the order and the chaos that love requires. From a young age, men are taught, either explicitly or implicitly, that their value is tied to their strength, their ability to control their emotions, and their capacity to endure hardship without complaint. This conditioning starts early and is reinforced by cultural expectations, social structures, and even personal experiences. The message is clear. To be a man is to be strong, and to be strong is to be silent. Vulnerability in many societies is associated with weakness, and weakness is unacceptable. So when a man craves someone, when he feels deeply for them, but remains silent, it is often not because he lacks emotion, but because he has been trained to suppress it. Silence from many men is not an absence of feeling, but a response to a world that has told them their feelings do not matter. Or worse, that expressing them will lead to ridicule, rejection, or a loss of respect. This is particularly true in romantic relationships, where men are often expected to take the lead, to be confident, to know exactly what they want and how to pursue it. But what happens when a man feels deeply but does not know how to express it? What happens when he has been taught that showing vulnerability could cost him the very thing he desires? He hesitates, he withdraws, he remains silent, not because he does not care, but because he does not know if he is allowed to care in the way that comes naturally to him. This conditioning runs so deep that many men do not even recognize it as conditioning. They believe their silence is rational, that their hesitation is logical, that their reluctance to express emotions is simply a personal trait rather than a learned response. They may not even realize that they are suppressing something because they have spent their entire lives being rewarded for their ability to maintain control. Society praises men who are composed, logical, and unshaken. But the same society often fails to teach men how to navigate the complex emotional realities of relationships, leaving them ill-equipped to deal with the very emotions they inevitably experience. When a man craves someone but remains silent, he may be experiencing an internal conflict between his feelings and his conditioning. On one hand, he wants to express his emotions, to make his desires known, to connect on a deeper level. On the other hand, doing so feels unnatural, even dangerous. If he has been hurt in the past, whether by romantic rejection, social ridicule, or personal failure, he may have learned that silence is safer than vulnerability. He may have internalized the belief that expressing his emotions only leads to For many men, the fear is not just about rejection, but about the potential consequences of emotional openness. If he reveals his feelings, he risks losing control of the situation. He risks being seen as weak. He risks being misunderstood. In some cases, he may even fear that by expressing his emotions, he will set expectations that he cannot fulfill. A man who desires someone but is unsure of his own ability to maintain a relationship may remain silent, not because he does not want the relationship, but because he fears disappointing both himself and the person he desires. This struggle is further complicated by modern dating dynamics, where mixed signals, fear of rejection, and concerns about appearing too eager or too distant all play a role. A man who is interested but hesitant may feel trapped between conflicting messages. Be assertive but not too aggressive. Be vulnerable but not weak. Be confident but not arrogant. If he has been raised in an environment where emotional expression was discouraged or even punished, these contradictions can leave him paralyzed. The paradox is that while society discourages emotional expression in men, it also demands emotional depth from them in relationships. Many men are expected to be emotionally available, communicative, and understanding, but without having been given the tools to develop these qualities. If a man has spent years suppressing his emotions, he may find himself at a loss when he suddenly needs to articulate them. He may crave connection but lack the emotional vocabulary to express that craving in a way that feels authentic to him. And so he chooses the path of least resistance, silence. However, silence does not mean apathy. In fact, silence often means the opposite. It can mean overthinking, self-doubt, and an internal battle between what he feels and what he has been conditioned to believe about expressing those feelings. The frustration for those on the receiving end of this silence is that it seems like indifference, when in reality it is often the result of a deeply ingrained struggle between societal expectations and personal truth. So what does this mean for relationships? It means that understanding a man's silence requires looking beyond the surface. It requires recognizing that his hesitation is not necessarily about a lack of care, but about a conflict between his emotions and his conditioning. It also means that while understanding his struggle is important, it is not an excuse for inaction. A man who truly desires something must, at some point, challenge the conditioning that holds him back. He must recognize that silence, while safe, is also limiting. It prevents connection, stunts growth, and ultimately leads to regret.
For a man who craves someone but remains silent, the choice is clear. Either remain trapped by the lessons of the past or step forward into a future where vulnerability is not weakness but strength. If he does not make that choice, then his silence is not just hesitation, it is a decision. And that decision ultimately determines the course of his relationships and his life. When a man craves someone but remains silent, it is often because he is engaged in a silent battle with himself, a battle between his emotions and his logic, his desires and his fears, his dreams and his insecurities. The modern world places immense pressure on men to have it all together before they pursue anything meaningful, especially relationships. A man who is ambitious, who sees his life as a work in progress, will often hesitate before stepping into a commitment. He understands that relationships require effort, emotional availability, and stability, and if he feels that he does not yet possess those things, he may choose to stay silent rather than risk entering into something he fears he cannot maintain. Many men are deeply aware of their flaws, their shortcomings, and the gaps in their own development. Some of them will not admit it, but it lingers in the back of their minds. They ask themselves difficult questions. Am I ready for this? Can I truly offer her what she deserves? What if I fail her? These thoughts can be overwhelming, especially for a man who holds himself to high standards. He may crave connection, but if he believes he is not yet at a place in his life where he can handle that connection responsibly, he will hesitate. He will remain silent, not because he does not care, but because he cares too much to step into something he is not prepared to sustain. This is where many people misunderstand the silence of a man who craves them. It is easy to assume that silence means a lack of interest or effort, but often it is the opposite. It is the manifestation of internal turmoil, of a man wrestling with himself over whether he has the right to pursue what he desires. If he takes relationships seriously, if he sees love as something that demands responsibility, then his silence is not a sign of disinterest, but a sign of deep thought. He is not only thinking about what he wants in the moment, he is considering the long-term implications of his actions. Men who have ambition, who have goals that extend beyond the immediate present, will often feel conflicted about relationships. They may see love as something they deeply desire, but also as something that could divert their focus from their larger mission. This is not to say that they do not believe in relationships, but rather that they want to be in a place where they can fully commit without compromising other aspects of their life. If a man feels that he is still building himself, still striving to become the person he wants to be, he may view a relationship as something that demands more from him than he can currently give. This is not an excuse for indecision, but it is an explanation. It is important to understand that many men do not want to enter into a relationship only to find themselves unable to sustain it. They do not want to promise something they cannot deliver. They do not want to let down the person they care about. And so, in their hesitation, in their uncertainty, they choose silence over action, believing that it is the more responsible path. However, this silence is also a test. A man who remains silent despite craving someone is testing his own discipline, his ability to resist temptation until he feels truly ready. He is asking himself whether he is making a choice based on fleeting emotions or long-term vision. He is evaluating whether his desire is strong enough to be worth the risk of stepping outside of his comfort zone. But here lies the paradox. No one is ever truly ready for love. No one reaches a point where they have mastered every aspect of themselves before stepping into a relationship. Growth does not happen in isolation. It happens through connection, through experience, through confronting the unknown. A man who waits for the perfect moment to pursue what he craves may end up waiting forever. There is no question that responsibility is important. A man should strive to be stable, to be strong, to be capable of handling the challenges that come with commitment. But he must also recognize that waiting for perfection is an illusion. There will never be a moment when every variable is under control. There will never be a time when he has eliminated all doubts, all fears, all insecurities. At some point, he must take a leap of faith, not just in the relationship, but in himself. He must trust that he can grow alongside the person he desires, rather than waiting to become someone he thinks he should be before he allows himself to love. The greatest danger of this mindset is that it can lead to missed opportunities. A man who hesitates for too long, who convinces himself that he is not ready, may one day wake up and realize that the person he craved is no longer there. That while he was busy questioning himself, life moved forward. And in that moment, he will have to ask himself, was I truly unready or was I simply afraid? Because at the end of the day, readiness is not about having all the answers. It is about having the courage to ask the right questions. It is about recognizing that love is not a destination, but a journey, one that requires movement, risk, and a willingness to step into uncertainty. A man who remains silent forever is not a man who is responsible. He is a man who has let his fear of imperfection hold him back from something real. And in doing so, he has made a choice, not just about love, but about the kind of life he is willing to live. When a man craves someone but remains silent, it is not always because he is unsure of his feelings. Often, it is because he fears rejection at a fundamental level. Rejection, to many men, is not just about being turned away. It is about failure, inadequacy, and a deep wound to their sense of self. It is not merely an external event, but an internal judgment, one that confirms their worst fears about themselves. A man who values his pride, who has spent his life building a sense of competence and control, will go to great lengths to avoid situations where he might face undeniable proof that he is not enough. From an evolutionary and psychological perspective, men are wired to seek status, competence, and respect. These qualities have been tied to survival for thousands of years. A man who is perceived as weak or incapable risked being excluded from his community, denied opportunities, and ultimately left vulnerable. While modern society no longer operates under such extreme conditions, these instincts remain deeply ingrained. Rejection still feels like exclusion. It still carries the weight of inadequacy. And for many men, it is easier to stay silent than to risk hearing, either explicitly or implicitly, that they do not measure up. This fear is not always rational, but it is powerful. It is amplified by past experiences, by stories heard from friends, by cultural narratives that tell men they must be good enough to win love. A man who has been rejected before, especially in a way that was painful or humiliating, will carry that experience with him. Even if he meets someone he craves, even if every part of him wants to take the risk, his mind will remind him of what happened the last time he allowed himself to be vulnerable. He will replay those moments, analyze every past failure, and convince himself that staying silent is the smarter choice. This is compounded by the fact that modern dating can be unforgiving. Many men feel that making the wrong move, saying the wrong thing, or expressing interest too openly can backfire. They worry about being seen as too eager, too emotional, or even desperate. They fear being mocked, dismissed, or placed in the dreaded category of not good enough. And so, rather than risk being viewed in a way that damages their pride, they choose inaction. They tell themselves they will wait for the right moment, for a sign that it is safe to proceed, for a guarantee that they will not be humiliated. But here is the paradox. Avoiding rejection does not lead to success. It leads to stagnation. It leads to missed opportunities, to regrets, to a life filled with what ifs and if onlys. The fear of rejection is a trap, one that keeps men from experiencing the very things they crave most: connection, passion, and love. Silence may feel like a protective barrier, but in reality it is a prison. It locks men in a state of inaction where they never truly win, but they also never truly lose. The only way to overcome this is to reframe rejection itself. A man who is afraid of rejection must ask himself, what am I truly afraid of? If he digs deep enough, he will realize that the fear is not of rejection itself, but of what rejection says about him. It challenges his identity, his worth, his sense of being valuable. But the truth is, rejection is not an objective verdict on a person's value. It is simply a mismatch, a momentary incompatibility, a decision that does not define his entire existence. A man must understand that every rejection he fears is a necessary part of growth. No one succeeds without failure. No one finds deep, meaningful love without risk. If he remains silent out of fear, he is choosing to stay in the illusion of safety rather than stepping into the reality of life. He is choosing comfort over courage, stagnation over progress, And in doing so, he is making the very failure he fears inevitable. Because the real failure is not rejection. The real failure is not trying at all. It is looking back years from now and realizing that he let fear control his choices, that he allowed himself to be ruled by doubt instead of action, that he let moments of potential slip through his fingers because he was too afraid to reach out and claim them. The irony is that the strongest men, the most respected, the most successful, are not those who have never faced rejection. They are the ones who have faced it repeatedly and kept going. They are the ones who have been turned away, laughed at, dismissed, and yet continued to push forward. They understand that rejection is not the end, it is a step. It is information. It is a lesson, and those who learn from it, who refuse to be broken by it, who recognize that their worth is not determined by any single moment of acceptance or rejection, these are the ones who ultimately win. A man who craves someone but remains silent must recognize this truth. He must understand that silence is not strength. Strength is stepping forward despite the fear. Strength is risking rejection in pursuit of something real. Strength is knowing that even if he fails, he is better off than the man who never tried. Because the man who takes a chance and is rejected at least walks away with knowledge. He knows where he stands, he knows he acted with courage, he knows he lived. But the man who stays silent, he walks away with nothing. No experience, no growth, no understanding, only the gnawing regret of never knowing what could have been. Silence, though often mistaken for indifference, is rarely that simple. When a man craves someone but remains silent, his inaction is not a lack of emotion, but the result of a deep internal struggle between his conditioning and his desires, between his fears and his hopes, between his need for control and the inherent unpredictability of human connection. He hesitates not because he does not care, but because he has been taught to suppress, to calculate, to avoid risk until certainty is guaranteed. But certainty never comes. Life does not reward those who wait in the shadows for the perfect moment. It rewards those who step forward despite the fear of imperfection. The truth is that silence is not strength. It is a shield, a false refuge from the discomfort of vulnerability, the pain of rejection, the risk of failure. A man who remains silent in the face of his desires is not avoiding pain, he is prolonging it. He is choosing regret over risk, stagnation over growth, fear over possibility. He tells himself that silence protects him, but in reality it robs him of what he wants most: connection, meaning, and the chance to build something real. The world is not kind to those who wait forever. Time moves forward, opportunities slip away, and the people we crave do not stand still. A man who refuses to act will eventually find himself left behind, wondering what could have been, mourning the moments he let pass, regretting the words he never spoke. And in the end, he must ask himself a question far more painful than any rejection. Did I truly live? To crave something is to acknowledge that something within you is longing for more. And if that is the case, then silence is not an option. Speak, act, risk, because in the end, the real tragedy is not in losing, it is in never trying at all.